Good evening, this is Goldie. It's Wednesday, September 15th, 2010. I have a live audience here tonight, a couple of campers at Camp Dogmore for boys, which means, as usual, their questions will be as incoherent as my answers. I want to say hi to my friends watching from inside the best extreme pond room in the world in Samra, Costa Rica. I'm still working on a website where I will post links to the articles I referred to and where the rants will reside. Excuse me. Remember, most importantly, I rant, so you don't have to. Also, what we're doing here is making a roadmap that a car can actually use if you understand the metaphor. Some people will say that my proposed changes to the Constitution can never get done. And all I can say is they outlawed alcohol in an amendment and reinstated its legality in an amendment to the Constitution. If those things can happen, then anything is possible. And I hope you don't think I'm just complaining, because I'm not. By the way, this really isn't a rant like O'Reilly or Glenn Beck or even Jon Stewart. It's a self-teaching seminar. And when I say self-teaching, I mean I teach myself with your help. I was speaking with my Tea Party friend the other day, and he was bringing up something about the spending that is happening out of a New York Times article that I'll read a bit later, which asserts that Democrats get political contributions from unions and Republicans get spending from corporations. I disagree with both assertions, by the way. And he asked me, how do we educate the population as to what we are talking about, like the structural regulatory defects, etc.? I asked him if he thought Sarah Palin talked about the things that I rant about, and he admitted no, she probably didn't. He then asked me if I thought Obama thought about this stuff, and I said I thought that he did once upon a time. Okay, so he asked, how do we get this message out to the people? And I realized, again, that we cannot get this message out to the uneducated population. We need to get it out to the leaders. I don't give a crap about trying to convince the Tea Partiers or the Republicans or the Democrats. Just the leaders of the Tea Party. Judge Napolitano, Glenn Beck, etc. Anyone who can lead a large group. We don't have time to try and convince the people. We have to let the leaders do that. So that's our goal. Find the leaders and convince them of our needed changes. By the way, the libertarian idea of if it's not in the Constitution, we shouldn't do it, while it's a great idea for thinking about things, it will never get done. My constitutional amendments are hard enough. So I was post-rant last week, September 8th, 2010. I was watching Jon Stewart, and I have to say, I'm really proud of myself. He did some comedy about the Koran burning and the comparison or connection that Fox News had harped on, which was Republican commentators comparing the Koran burning and the mosque near Ground Zero. I'm proud because I have a few fans that watch Jon Stewart regularly and get the bulk of their news from him. And I'm also proud because I did my rant 2 hours before he aired his show. I could tell he was having a little problem, however, with the John Oliver portion of it, but he did the reasoning why you should not ask moderates to apologize for the zealotry of the extremists. And he did it by using the book Portnoy's Complaint, acting as though it was an ancient Jewish text. And he actually went to obscenity, much as South Park does. However, both he and the clips of the Republicans saying that the mosque at Ground Zero showed the frustration of the American people missed the main point. And that is that people need to deal with being offended in order to keep the sanctity of certain fundamental rights, which in the case of the Koran burning is freedom of speech, and in the case of the mosque at Ground Zero, freedom of religion. He did make me laugh, however, so watch my September 8th, 2010 rant and then pull up his first segment and compare us. He's funny, but he fails to make that most important connection in his complaint of the Republican arguments. All right, going back to message words and phrases. On September 7th, 2010, when I was driving through the hurricane like an idiot, excuse me, I was listening to some Republican radio guys, and sorry, I can't remember their names, and they were talking about how the job of government is solely to help wealth creation. And they were complaining of the huge government spending that was only making busy work. He called it that, busy work. In one of their digressions, they talked about how the liberal court of Justice John Roberts had decided the Kelo case, which allowed eminent domain to be used for purely economic purposes. As I yelled at the radio, I realized the total lack of understanding in this country caused by partisan politics. The Kelo case, and see my eminent domain #1 rant. The Kelo case allowed governments to hand property over to favored corporate interests that would produce higher tax revenues, in comparison to the traditionally accepted notion of eminent domain being used for railroads, highways, schools, basically public purposes. I would really not call that liberal. It was basically state or patron capitalism, where the government grants favors to its buddies. It's non-capitalism at its worst. It creates uncertainty, which we all know from my eminent domain rant, is the enemy of maximization of profits for corporations, and is the enemy of individuals trying to maximize their personal good. I just wanted to point out that these Republicans who called themselves conservatives had to use the word liberal to refer to the Supreme Court, which is neither liberal nor conservative in the true sense of either word, just because these Republican commentators, were opposed to the decision. So since they were opposed, they assigned the word liberal to it. Thanks, guys. This was a classic case of a message word devoid of meaning. On September 8th, 2010, Jon Stewart had Tim Kaine, the Democratic chairman, and he stated flatly to Kaine that the Democrats are not getting their message out. Maybe they need to hear my healthcare rant #1. I have stated flatly that the surveys that show that the majority of Americans that don't like healthcare bill are flawed because of two main things. #1, Americans that have either not been covered under their current health insurance or been denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition like the new law. And 2, Americans that say they don't like the law have not had the experience of not being covered under their existing policy, have not read their policy, and have never had a pre-existing condition. In a Wall Street Journal blog dated February 2010 by Naftali Ben-David, Harry Reid said Americans liked the health care bill the more they understood it. Let me read it to you, because it's important. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid responded today to a Missouri vote that Republicans call a rebuke to the sweeping new health care law by saying voters like the legislation better the more they know about it. At issue is Proposition C, a measure on the Missouri ballot Tuesday that seeks to block the government from requiring individuals to buy health insurance, a pillar of President Barack Obama's new health law. The state referendum is presumably overruled by the federal law. Excuse me. But its passage by a 71-29 margin, is being widely cited by Republicans Wednesday as a sign that voters reject the health law. Missouri sent a clear message to Democrats in the Obama administration that government-run health care is a gross overreach of the federal government that needs to be repealed and replaced, Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele said in a statement. Reid noted that Tuesday's turnout was low at 23%, but his main argument was that people will like the law better the more they see its benefits. It's very obvious that people have a lack of understanding of our health care reform bill, Reid said. Duh. The more people learn about this bill, the more they like it. He noted that the health insurance exchanges or marketplaces will take 3 years to kick in. Reid cited recent polls suggesting that the health law is becoming more popular, though a significant number of Americans still oppose it. The trend is turning all over America today, Reid said. Once you explain what's in the bill, the American people, of course, like it. Or if they read it before they opined on it, that might be helpful too. My main point is that, as I will make fun of Dana Perino later, people who do not read and have not had a pre-existing condition or have not been denied coverage are the ones that don't like the bill. And they haven't even read it. It is these people who I cannot convince of anything. And these are the same people who we need to get the leaders of to understand the true choices and options. Okay, so here was a tiny article in the Austin American-Statesman on 9/10/2010 entitled Snooping on Bauer's Box. I've gone to surveillance here. More than half a dozen public employees snooped in confidential state records for personal information on American Idol runner-up Bowersox, officials said. Oh, sorry, it's Bowersox, officials said Thursday. 2 workers were ousted after the breaches were discovered, including a licensing bureau worker who was pleaded not guilty to a felony charge. The charges were first reported by the Columbus Dispatch. The bluesy Bowersox, who grew up in Elliston in Northwest Ohio, said the snooping made her feel violated. Quote, "I don't think any of the people who participated in it would have wanted it to happen to them or their family members," Bowersox told the Blade of Toledo. "That's disgusting," she said. Oh, really? She felt violated. And 2 of the 5 people who looked at the information have been dismissed. Are you kidding me? Again, Cindy, you know who you are. You trust the cops to keep the images of your nude daughter off of YouTube? How many more examples do we need? Your argument fails for surveillance. It always fails, since they cannot keep this data private. And I'm going to keep pointing out these examples. It's my main argument on why we can't have surveillance. These guys can't be trusted. It's not possible. I don't care how hard the penalties are. It becomes irreparable harm when those images get out. This Bowersox thing is just an example. They were looking for pictures. What if there was a camera that had been anywhere near her house? There would have been people looking at it going, that's the American Idol's house. All right. Democracy Now! This is a show that's on FS-TV, and I don't know if it's on Time Warner. I think I've seen it on Time Warner, just called Democracy Now! Democracy Now! On September 9th, 2010, reported that Contra Costa County is using federal stimulus funds. As I've said before, Obama is more of the same, just like George Bush. They're using federal stimulus funds through a grant to Head Start to put RFID chips into the pockets of children in a preschool so that the information on the RFID can be read up to 100 meters away. The school district is saying that the program is only for the assistance of the teachers. However, the technology is currently used for cattle, prisoners, and products moving through manufacturing plants. The ACLU person that they interviewed, Nicole Ozer, who was being interviewed from San Francisco, pointed out that last year, a person using $250 of parts from a Radio Shack was able to build a reader to read these types of chips, or smart cards on enhanced driver's licenses, which we're still fighting about here in Texas. I've also heard anecdotal evidence that there are readers that can be used on the street to read your credit card in your wallet as the criminal walks past you. Additionally, once the RFID in this preschool has been read, a duplicate chip could be made to show that the student is still on the campus, when in fact the student has been kidnapped. It's another example of the slippery slope of the loss of the expectation of privacy. And it's in the name of children. We want to figure out where our kids are. So let's put a chip in them. The proponent says there's no information being put on the chip, just the child's name, nothing else. I feel so comfortable with the assurances given. It's another example of the Obama more of the same, no difference from the Bush administration, complete lack of care for civil liberties. So don't think, you Democrats, that because you voted for a Democrat or you vote for a Democrat, that any of these things we talk about, any of them, are being protected by any of these guys. They're not. Y'all laugh at me that I have a yellow sticky over the camera in my computer. But Democracy Now! On September 9th, 2010 reported that in suburban Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Obama's Justice Department is not pursuing charges against the school district when school employees were looking at students through school-issued computers. So they were turning on the camera from a remote location to look at the kids through the computer. It's another example of the misuse of government-run surveillance cameras. The original purpose was to find stolen laptops. It can monitor IP addresses and take a screenshot of whatever was on the screen. Apparently, they left the cameras on, is what they claimed, when the laptops were returned, and they ended up capturing images of children in various states of undress. as I say it. Some of them had clothing on, some had taken off some clothes. All right. Here's a personal experience from a white friend of mine, and I say he's white so that you can realize that, yes, white people can feel the sting of profiling, but in another way than is happening under the Arizona law, and actually the federal law, which mirrors the Arizona law. And I believe, by the way, that federal law is just as unconstitutional, the one that the Arizona immigration law mirrors. But anyway, this is a separate example that just gives you the feeling. And I do this for the continuing reason of trying to show you, like the Chinese labor camps rant that I did, what it feels like under this new evolving no privacy system as in the movie 1984. All right, here's the thing that he sent me. Hey Goldie, my son and I were on a flight from Philly to Houston with a stopover in Jacksonville. We had a long stop, so they let us off the plane to wait in the terminal. The flight attendant warned us that we shouldn't leave the security zone because we don't have boarding passes to return, since we're staying on the same flight. TSA don't play, he said. Excuse me. Not 10 minutes after we settled into seats in the terminal, we were approached by 2 TSA agents. We're doing a spot check of documents. Please show us your ID and boarding passes. I felt a little chill. The officer demanded my papers. I didn't have papers. I briefly explained the situation. She looked at me blankly at first, then with suspicion. She was clearly not buying my story, and I felt a little of the same fear that every person feels when faced with an authority figure whose power far exceeds their wisdom, which is all of them, by the way. Luckily, the other TSA agent understood and explained to her in a low voice that it was a through flight, so my moment of fear ended there. This stuff is real. This is the slippery slope you ran about. Right now it's in the air terminal. At any moment, they can declare that the color orange doesn't apply. Now the color is red, and this will occur on street corners, like it already does in New York City. We invest greater and greater power into the hands of an imperfect few for flimsier and flimsier reasons, and we have less and less recourse to challenge their errors and their abuses. First, we accept the idea that in a limited situation, the foot is in the door, the camel's nose is in the tent. Then we give in incrementally. I think people do value liberty and accept some increased risk to preserve it. We risk death on the freeway in order to have the freedom of travel. But this insidious slippery slope robs us of liberty a little at a time and gets us to agree by exaggerating the dangers. Now show me those papers. I want to thank you, you know who you are, for that email and that story. Hopefully, it conveys the feeling that I fear, and all of you should fear, the feeling that a friend of mine felt in the no constitution zone, so-called, by the ACLU. It's the area within 100 miles of any border where no probable cause is needed to pull you over. They were apparently pulling over every car, running a dog over the car and checking papers for no reason, except that there is a federal statute that allows it. Where are my Tea Party friends? Where are my libertarian friends? This is exactly what the founders had in mind with unreasonable search and seizure in the Fourth Amendment. It's called a no constitution zone by the ACLU. I didn't know about it. I'm going to do some more research on it, but a buddy of mine got pulled over and got into some trouble. All right. It was 9/11/2010. And commentators were busy patting themselves on the back as to how this is the greatest nation in the world, and we're the greatest, most tolerant people in the world. I'm reminded of a past rant where a friend of mine from California with a daughter said she liked surveillance cameras. Out of my thinking and ranting about that issue, I reviewed the Austin COPS manual that said the only measurable positive effect about surveillance cameras was that they make you feel safer. I then did a rant that said that that is exactly the opposite effect that you need. Think about it. In an unsafe area, if there are cameras, you should not feel safer or let your guard down. You should be more on your guard. Similarly, when we think of ourselves as the greatest country, we let our guard down about privacy, religious zealotry, racial profiling, racism, trust in our corporations, and trust in our government. Although a little blurb in today's Austin American Statesman shows an actual reason, unlike freedom fries, why we should not try to be like certain European nations. Let me read it to you. Lawmakers approved ban on Islamic veils. Paris. The French Senate voted 246 to 1. 246 to 1. Almost unanimously. I wonder who that one person is. They voted that way to ban the wearing of the Islamic all-body veil, or burqa, in all public places. Already passed by the National Assembly in July, the ban is now scheduled to become law early next year. In an attempt to head off any legal challenges over religious and other freedoms, parliamentary leaders have asked a special body to ensure the law passes constitutional muster. The Constitutional Council has 1 month to rule. My freaking God. What the hell do they think they are doing? It would be like passing a law against yarmulkes for Jews in this country, or the banning of the wearing of a nun's habit, or the banning of the wearing of a priest's collar, or the banning of the wearing of the Pope's hat. I guess we can be happy and say at least we're not that bad yet, almost. No, we just say you can't build a mosque right there. Okay. Going back to my structural regulatory defect regarding the ability of corporations to give unlimited sums to political campaigns. There's an article in the New York Times, 9/11/2010, entitled GOP Leader is Tightly Bound to Lobbyists. House Democrats were preparing late last year for the first floor vote on the financial regulatory overhaul when Representative John A. Boehner of Ohio and other Republican leaders summoned more than 100 industry lobbyists to Capitol Hill for a private strategy session. Pardon me. The bill's passage in the House already seemed inevitable, but Mr. Boehner and his deputies told the Wall Street lobbyists and trade association leaders that by teaming up, they could still perhaps block its final passage or at least water it down. Okay, but Mr. Boehner and his deputies told the Wall Street lobbyists and trade association leaders that by teaming up, so team up, lobbyists, with us, then you can still perhaps block its final passage or at least water it down. This is the regulatory reform of what caused the economic collapse. Quotes, "We need you to get out there and speak up against this," Mr. Boehner said that December afternoon, according to 3 people familiar with his remarks, while also warning against cutting side deals with Democrats. That sort of alliance, they won a few skirmishes, though they lost the war on the regulatory bill, is business as usual for Mr. Boehner, the House Minority Leader and would-be Speaker if Republicans win the House in November. He maintains especially tight ties with a circle of lobbyists and former aides representing some of the nation's biggest businesses, including Goldman Sachs, Google, Citigroup, RJ Reynolds, Miller Coors, and UPS. They have contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to his campaigns over the years, provided him rides on their corporate jets, socialized with him at luxury golf resorts and waterfront bashes, and are now leading fundraising efforts for his Boehner for Speaker campaign, which is soliciting checks of up to $37,800 each, the maximum allowed. A side note, the Citizens United case now allows for those corporations to buy for Boehner unlimited ads and other campaign goodies, which is what they need those funds for anyway. So the $37,800 limitation is the actual amount you can donate to the campaign. Some of the lobbyists readily acknowledge routinely seeking his office help, calling the congressman and his aides as often as several times a week to advance their agenda in Washington. And in many cases, Mr. Boehner has helped them out. How many times do they take my call? I can only give 100. I can barely give 100. As Democrats increasingly try to cast the Ohio congressman as the face of the Republican Party, President Obama mentioned his name 8 times in a speech last week. As Mr. Boehner becomes more visible, his ties to lobbyists cultivated since he arrived there in 1991 are coming under attack. And I'm not singling out Republicans. This is just the example of a Republican. The Democrats are equally as guilty. when you talk about Chris Dodd and Barney Frank as to the money that they collected from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. All right, the woman he hopes to replace, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, derided him on Friday as having met countless times with special interest lobbyists in an effort to stop tough legislation that would regulate corporations and protect consumers. And the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, through a spokeswoman, charged that he epitomizes the smoke-filled backroom special interest deal-making that turns off voters about Washington. I agree. But they all do it, okay? And I'm about to get to that. Mr. Boehner, who declined to be interviewed for this article, and his lobbyist allies ridicule such criticism as politically motivated by desperate Democrats. As in the movie in 1984, look for the enemy. Always look at the enemy. In 1984, it was Goldstein, or it was Eurasia. And if you made friends with them, you had a new enemy. There was always an enemy. It's how you pass a lie detector test. You focus on the one thing that's true. His actions, they say, simply reflect the pro-business, anti-regulatory philosophy that he has espoused for more than 3 decades, dating back to when Mr. Boehner, the son of a tavern owner, ran a small plastics company in Ohio. And fielding requests from lobbyists is nothing unusual, he says. Here it is. I get lobbied every day by somebody, he said last month after a speech in Cleveland. It could be by my wife. It could be the bellman. Goes on all day, every place. Goldy opines, this is correct, and that is the defect. Okay, going back to the article. Mr. Boehner, and by the way, I'm definitely not worried about his wife lobbying him or the bellman. The bellman says, have a good day and vote for tax cuts for the poor, or whatever he says. All right, back to the article, sorry. Mr. Boehner, a 60-year-old perpetually tanned, sharply tailored, chain-smoking golfer, is not as fiery as Newt Gingrich or as unrelenting an arm twister as Tom DeLay, 2 of his Republican predecessors in top House posts. Excuse me. Excuse me. It's his reputation as a Chamber of Commerce Republican and his fundraising skills. He's raised, hang on, more water. He's raised $36 million for Republican causes during this election cycle, more than almost anyone else in his party. That explains, in part, his rise. If elected as his party's leader in the House, Mr. Boehner will certainly lean on his industry allies for help as he builds coalitions necessary to push legislation through Congress his office acknowledges. His friends say there is nothing wrong with that. His friends. Does he have a lot of relationships in this city? Yes, absolutely, said Mark Isaacowitz, a friend whose Republican firm represents more than 36 financial, telecommunications, energy, and consumer products companies as diverse as Coca-Cola and Zurich Financial Services. But I think all the good lawmakers do. This is the guy who's the lobbyist, okay? Mr. Boehner won some of his first national headlines back in 1996 after he was caught handing out checks from tobacco lobbyists to fellow Republicans on the House floor. Then the 4th-ranking House Republican, Mr. Boehner, said he had broken no rules and was simply assisting his lobbyist friends who were contributing to other Republican campaigns. Remember, in the middle of this article, he said, it goes on all day, every place. Okay. So I'm not just singling out the Republicans, and that's the key to my theory. I was just as hard on the Democrats last week about their ties to union donors as the Republicans and Democrats are both tied to their corporate donors. And that's what we must and can change. I really do believe that. And it's not by electing Democrats. It's not by electing Republicans. It may be by electing Tea Partiers. I hate to say it, but it may be. In a Monday, September 13th, 2010 New York Times article, I'm further sickened. Interest group spending drives GOP lead in ads by Michael Luo. And I'll read it in its entirety. I'm trying to sicken you as well. Outside groups supporting Republican candidates in House and Senate races across the country have been swamping their Democratic-leaning counterparts on television since early August, as the midterm election season has begun heating up. Driving the disparity in the ad wars has been an array of Republican-oriented organizations that are set up so that they can accept donations of unlimited size from individuals and corporations without having to disclose them. The situation raises the possibility that a relatively small cadre of deep-pocketed donors, unknown to the general public, is shaping the battle for Congress in the early going. As though this is something new, by the way. The yawning gap in independent interest group spending is alarming some Democratic officials who argue that it amounts to an effort on the part of super wealthy Republican donors, as well as corporate interests, newly emboldened by regulatory changes to buy the election. While each of our campaigns has the resources they need to be competitive, we now face shadow groups, putting their thumbs on the scale with undisclosed, unlimited, and unregulated donations, said Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, probably in a fundraising letter. As the primary season ends this week and the general election begins in earnest, the nightmare for the Democrats is that this is just the beginning. Tracking by Democratic media buyers, in fact, shows that other large chunks of television time have been set aside in the coming weeks in key House races by more Republican-leaning groups. The snapshot of early television spending would seem to be a fulfillment of Democrats' worst fears after the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in the Citizens United case in January that lifted a ban on direct corporate spending on political campaigns. Let me just tell you something. The Democrats' worst fears and the Republicans' worst fears are that we do a constitutional amendment to overturn that Citizens United case. If the Democrats lose a few seats, that is not their worst fear. Their worst fear is that they actually no longer get money from Exxon and BP. Their worst fear is when they get out of office, they don't go to work for Exxon and BP. Their worst fear is that the maximum amount that can be given in a campaign is $100 by an individual only, no groups. Their worst fear is that we limit their terms to 2 terms, and for senators, maybe 1, I don't know, maybe 2 4-year terms. Those are their worst fears. That's why you don't hear about them. They're saying that's their worst fear, give us more money, because we've got a campaign against these Republicans. All right, back to the article. It's not clear, however, whether it is actually an influx of new corporate money unleashed by the Citizens United decision that is driving the spending chasm, or other factors, notably a political environment that favors Republicans. There are clues about the financing, though, like the 2 separate $1 million contributions from Louisiana companies tied to Harold Simmons, a Texas billionaire and longtime Republican donor who helped finance Swift Boat for Veterans for Truth, as revealed in the campaign finance filings of one of the Republican-oriented groups, American Crossroads, or that David Koch, the billionaire co-owner of Koch Industries, helped found another major player, Americans for Prosperity. And by the way, they're tied to the Tea Party, but that is not a reason why we can't use the Tea Party, I promise. Corporations have so far mostly chosen not to take advantage of the Citizens United ruling to directly sponsor campaign ads themselves. So far. Okay? Some, however, are likely funneling more money into campaigns through some of these independent groups, said Lawrence M. Noble, a lawyer at Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, a former general counsel for the Federal Election Commission. They had the right to make such contributions before the ruling, he said, but Citizens United made it more straightforward. There's a greater comfort level, Mr. Noble said. Disclosure laws, however, make it impossible to know for sure where the money for these groups is coming from in most cases. Corporate interests are buying the elections, said Sheila Krumholtz, executive director for the Center for Responsive Politics, a watchdog group. Oh no, it's much worse than that. We don't know who's buying the election. If the trend on television continues and extends across other types of independent group spending, it would be a reversal from the past. In recent elections, it's Democrats who have used so-called soft money vehicles, which are able to accept unrestricted donations, to a much greater degree. In 2006, for example, the last midterm election, Democratic-leaning 527 groups, named for the part of the tax code they fall under, outspent Republican-leaning ones in federal races $121 million to $65 million, according to the Center for Responsive Politics. The groups that perfected this were on the Democratic side, said Stephen Law, President and Chief Executive Officer of American Crossroads, and its sister organization, Crossroads GPS. Crossroads GPS has been the biggest third-party player on television by far since early August. In Senate races, Republican-leaning interest groups outspent Democratic-leaning ones on television $10.9 million to $1.3 million from August 1st to September 8th, according to Campaign Media Analyst Group, a company that tracks political advertising. In the House, Republican-leaning groups outspent Democratic-leaning ones $3.1 million to $1.5 million. I can't wait to see what the final tallies are, by the way, at the end of this season. Television spending by the candidates themselves was fairly even during the period, with Republicans in the Senate pouring out about $19.6 million compared to $17.3 million by Democrats in the House. Democrats spent $7.6 million to the Republicans $7 million. Spending by the party committees was negligible. Fear has been building for some time among Democratic operatives that third-party spending on all fronts this year would favor Republicans based on declarations by various groups on the amounts they were hoping to devote to this election. Spending on other activities, however, are much more difficult to track. Television advertising is, therefore, a useful gauge. And think about that. The networks, they're not going to want to have this limitation on who gets to spend money. They're making tons of money. That's another vested interest group that's giving donations to all the candidates to make sure that the type of constitutional amendments that I talked about and that MoveOn.org wants to do and that one constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United does not happen. So we know who the enemies are. We can figure them out. We figured out the problem. We know the enemies. We're just going to have to figure it out. How do we overturn it? Okay. Back to the article. In Senate races over the last month, Crossroads GPS spent $4.8 million in California, Kentucky, Missouri, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. It was followed by the United States Chamber of Commerce, a Republican-leaning trade association, which spent $2.9 million in television advertising in Illinois, Missouri, and New Hampshire. Fundraising for both of the Crossroad groups has been spearheaded by Karl Rove, the former political strategist for President George W. Bush, and Ed Gillespie, former Republican Party chairman. The groups are well on their way to meeting their combined fundraising goal of just over $50 million for this election, Mr. Law said. Crossroads GPS is organized as a 501c4 nonprofit, meaning it legally cannot devote more than half of its activities to politics. But it also means that it does not have to disclose its donors. Excuse me. American Crossroads, on the other hand, recently filed paperwork to become an independent expenditure political action committee, a new classification for third-party groups made possible by a pair of recent advisory opinions by the FEC after the Citizens United decision. Such groups can accept donations of unlimited size, but are required to regularly disclose their donors. Who cares if you're disclosed or not? That's not the danger. That is just not the danger. That's a red herring. Perhaps, not so coincidentally, American Crossroads spent only $437,000 on television in August and early September, much less than its sister organization. Donations revealed in campaign finance filings by American Crossroads, however, offer a glimpse of the kinds of hefty contributions its leaders have been soliciting. There are the $1 million contributions linked to Mr. Simmons, and another $1 million donation came from a trust controlled by Jerry Perenchio, a former chairman of Univision, and another major contributor to GOP causes. Meanwhile, the biggest sponsor of television advertising in House races over the last month was Americans for Prosperity, which spent about $1.5 million targeting races in which Republican candidates are at a fundraising disadvantage. Americans for Prosperity is another 501c4 which does not have to disclose its donors. Mr. Koch, who has mostly supported Republicans over the years, serves as the chairman of its sister organization, Americans for Prosperity Foundation, which is much more limited in its political activities because it's set up as a 501c3 nonprofit. A major question is how big a mark labor unions will be able to make for Democrats. They have mostly held their fire on television up to this point. Other than some spending by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the Citizens United decision frees them up to more directly support candidates as well. But even their leaders seem to indicate that they would not be able to match pro-Republican expenditures over the airwaves. If we try to compete in that game, we can't compete, said Richard Trumka, president of the AFL-CIO. They have so much more resources. Give us money. We need to compete. We need to give money to our people. This is just so screwed up, okay? So I have to ask, where am I wrong in calling for a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United? Drastically limit campaign contributions to individuals only, not to exceed $100. Institute term limits for reps and senators, and prohibit revolving doors for regulators. Seriously, is this not the problem? I ask you. Actually, it's not the whole problem. It is what leads to the handouts and bad regulation and bad privatizations and bad tax policy. So let's go back to the beginning again. Let's go back to the commons. I love the commons, the green commons. The reason that I harp and harp and harp on the commons is because the concept allows us to get to the heart of the problems in the United States politically and regulatorily. And allows us to get to about 80% of the economic problems in the U.S. Apparently, I really want you to read two books by Garrett Hardin, The Immigration Dilemma, Avoiding the Tragedy of the Commons, and Living Within Limits. Interestingly, both are actually about population control. Excuse me. And over the past few months, I've only given tiny references to that main point, population control. I use this concept of the commons because it's right. Here's another way to look at the commons with a quote from Living Within Limits. A stockman, which is a person who runs cattle, in the western United States can raise his cattle either on private land or on government land managed by the Forest Service. In Idaho, as of 1990, the grazing fee on public land was only 1/5 what it was on private land. We can assume that a private landowner sets his fee to cover the true cost of maintaining the carrying capacity of the land indefinitely. Okay? We're talking about private free enterprise or the free market, whatever the heck that means. This is freer. We can assume that a private landowner sets his fee to cover the true cost of maintaining the carrying capacity of the land indefinitely. Obviously, the government is not following this prudent rule. In direct costs, the Forest Service paid out $35 million for maintaining its grazing lands, the cost being offset by only $11 million. So they paid out $35 million for maintaining, the cost being offset by only $11 million taken in as fees. Who paid the deficit? Taxpayers, of course. Costs were commonized, while the profits from the sale of beef were privatized to the stockmen. So think about that. Costs were commonized, while the profits from the sale of the beef were privatized to the stockmen. The formula for this game is simple. Commonized costs, privatized profits, which can be abbreviated to the CCPP game. Hardin is so insightful in this regard. Think about where this happens. BP oil leases in the Gulf, mining in the West, tree chopping in the national forests, polluting industries like coal that do not pay the cost of the asthma and lung cancer they cause, blowing off the mountaintop mining where the mining companies do not pay the cost of cleaning up the stream and water that they pollute, mercury pollution, basically any and all pollution where the net effects are not paid by the polluter, which is everywhere, by the way. Commonized costs, privatized profits. This leads back to the structural regulatory defect of the regulated writing the regulations because they give the giant donations. I just really like his example and the use of the CCPP phrasing. Commonized costs, privatized profits. I'm going to continue to use it. So as we continue on with these analyses, let's keep looking at the using of taxpayers' funds as a use of the commons. So we're going to call taxpayer funds commons. Let's look at the use of taxpayer funds for education. as a use of the commons. Okay, sorry. Let's look at the use of taxpayer funds for education as a use of the commons. Let's look at the use of taxpayer funds for health care as a use of the commons. And remember, the use of the taxpayer funds is only one prong of the commons. It's a little more complicated than that. The other prong is the interest that we have in having our citizens healthy and educated. That's a different type of commons. That collective health and education is also a commons, which has been defined as something owned by all and by no one in particular, like air, land, and water. I've talked about it every time I talk about the commons, okay? All right, moving on. By the way, you can stop watching TV until the election. On Monday, September 13th, 2010, on Fox and Friends, which is a painful, painful show to watch. I do it for you, so you don't have to. Dana Perino, George W. Bush's press secretary, said, "I find it a little offensive and a little insulting that not a single Democrat would want to stand behind their vote for health care." Dana. I find it offensive and a little insulting that you're misusing the words offensive and insulting. Clearly, her sweet little butt does not yet have a pre-existing condition. Also, my Tea Party friend and I were discussing the health care bill, and I realized that there is a disconnect or a lack of understanding about health care. Health care is not, and I know I'm repeating myself here, but I got to do it. Health care is not an inkjet cartridge. It's something totally different. When someone tries to make more money on an inkjet cartridge, generally speaking, people don't die. When a healthcare company tries to make more money on healthcare, people die. I understand that the federal government may not be the most efficient vehicle for providing healthcare, but certainly private industry cannot be given correct incentives to provide it, unless I'm missing something. They need to make profits. So by definition, they need to cut costs. That's how it works. That's how we want it to work. It just can't work for that particular product. Well, let's look at it in another way. Let's say Halliburton was put in charge of providing health care that the VA, the Veterans Administration, now provides. As bad as the VA is, I shudder at the thought of it being done by Halliburton for a profit. I couldn't even imagine, actually. Please someone correct me where I'm wrong on this. And I don't want to hear the argument that the federal government can't provide it because they're just incompetent. Because there's no question, if you read your policy, read and see if it will give you a heart transplant or a liver transplant. Read and see. Read and see what your original application looked like. Read and see whether or not you actually have a pre-existing condition. Go in today to your dermatologist and have them look at every spot on your back and see if you have a pre-existing condition. Don't give your real name. Pay cash. Because if they know it, you will never get covered by a healthcare company. Okay. Another message, election message, was from Newt Gingrich, presidential candidate for next year, or 2012, who spewed similar election message, and I can only say crap about economic policy. And remember, he needs to raise money from the very wealthy for his presidential run. Contradicting numerous studies, bipartisan studies, by the way, that you get the least bang for the buck by dropping tax rates for the wealthy. That's the big argument right now. It's all election message, so stay away from it. I don't want to hear it. I want to point out one thing. As an attorney that has represented these high earners, I can assure you that except for pushing income into capital gains, there is no effect. I've never seen an effect on the number of deals that they do based on marginal income tax rates. None. There is no effect. Okay, I'm going to go true rant right now for a change, although I've been doing it this time. Obama, Newt Gingrich, and many others are saying the same things about the Koran burning in the mosque, not at ground zero. They're saying that these are both examples of the fact that even though you might have a right to do something, maybe you should not do that thing. I disagree. When everyone agrees in our government on something, I'm going to go ahead and say that most of the time, when you have a right to do something, you should do that thing. And maybe you must do that thing. Okay? So when everybody is saying you shouldn't do this, and it's about a fundamental right, I'm going to go ahead and say maybe you should do it, and you may even have a duty that raises to the level of you must do that thing. I actually think that that guy should have burned the Koran. And by the way, there's a bunch of them on YouTube, okay, Koran burnings. And I think the mosque should be built, specifically because you have the right to do it. And it's a fundamental right. I understand people will take offense, but that's the point. Plus, by General Petraeus and Obama trying to talk this pastor in Florida down from the ledge, it's only going to inspire other extortionists to threaten to burn this book. Also, since the opponents of the mosque are using the excuse of the extremism of the imam and suspicious funding for the mosque, then why would moving in another 3 blocks beyond the existing mosque, which is 4 blocks from ground zero, satisfy these concerns? It's all racist election year BS. And even Democrats are falling for it. Don't you fall for it. Burning a book? Like in the movie The Day After Tomorrow? Remember when they burned the books in the library? It's not like yelling fire in a crowded theater. These particular extremists are using, they have plenty of excuses to be attacking the troops. They don't need another excuse to do an IED. We shouldn't be in those regions anyway, but that's another story. Okay. But again, burning a book is not like yelling fire in a crowded theater. And building a mosque near ground zero, it is not like yelling fire in a crowded theater. Get over it. It is much more important that the Nazis march. It is much more important that the KKK marches than that they offend some people. It's much more important that South Park makes fun of Jews in every episode, and a black kid named Token, and Timmy, and Jimmy, handicapped. My God, get over it. I've gotten over it. All right, that's all there is today. I would suggest watching Free Speech TV. I have it on DirecTV. It's FSTV, and that's where I get Democracy Now, although it's definitely pro-Democratic Party. I have seen it on Time Warner, or at least Democracy Now, so I don't know if you get that Tom Hartman program in the middle of the day. He's pretty pro-Democrat, but those guys really bring up some good free speech items if you can get over their message. It's a lot better than MSNBC. I want to thank our sponsors, all of which support this forum of conversation, but not necessarily the content. PianoByAngelo.com, Angelo Limbesis, who teaches and plays keyboards all over Austin. ZitaDesign.com, ZITA Design.com for all of your decorative painting needs. She can make anything look like anything. AustinAreaPlumbing.com for all of your plumbing problems and redos. TicoAdventureLodge.com, T-I-C-O AdventureLodge.com, a small hotel in Samara, Costa Rica. CNC Surf School in Samara, which is at cncsurfsamara.webs.com. La Vela Latina, a great sunset restaurant in Samara. And Amhar Tequila at www.santospirits.com, an extremely smooth tequila. Also, I don't know the exact website, but it's in Samara. It's the Logan. I have some good friends who have supported my talks. I'll try and get their website for you for next week. But it's another hotel in Samara. Thank you and God bless.